Get your 90s kids hats on, guys, because we're going to the decade of nostalgia. To me, the 90s was the era in gaming that set a lot of trends and standards to come. Most people's favourite games of their past comes from this era, or if you're younger, I'm sure your games garnered influence from this generation. One of the most prominent genres that really shone during this time is horror. So here's the top 10 most influential horror games from the 90s. Alone in the Dark was one of the most influential horror games for its time. The first game was released in 1992 with a storyline following the writing of American author H.P. Lovecraft, with later games drawing inspiration from Voodoo, Wild West, and even surrealist painter H.R. Geiger. This game is included in the Guinness World Records Gamer Edition 2008 as the first 3D horror game. It is also one of the first 3D games with polygonal characters. Alone in the Dark was developed by the help of young Christoph Derdinichin and his game Alpha Waves. Alpha Waves was one of the first 3D home video games, and was surprisingly a robust software-driven, polygon-based jumping and exploration game. He developed this game in hopes of landing an internship at Infogames, but he impressed the company so much that he was granted a huge money investment. Later, this game was changed, 3D was added, characters from Cthulhu stories were included, and Alone in the Dark emerged. The game, Seventh Guest, was received very positively at the summer 1992 Consumer Electronics Show, going on to sell more than 2 million copies. It was released in 1993 and pushed what was technically possible for its day. It was one of the first games released only on CD-ROM, as it was so detailed and graphically elaborate that the floppy disk was simply too small for it. Many gamers had a lot of problems running it, as its minimum requirements were unrealistic of those around May 1993. This adventure puzzle game features one of the best horror stories told from the unfolding perspective of the player as an amnesiac. It featured live-action video clips, which were one of the popular qualities of Seventh Guest, accompanied with pre-rendered 3D graphic and adult content. Dr. Hauser, which was released in 1994, gained a lot of attention from the get-go. It was praised for its unique storyline and new idea of horror, as there are no mysterious creatures haunting you, no enemies trying to kill you, no spells trying to make you fail. No, Dr. Hauser features a different way of horror. You are trying to escape from what seems like quite a normal house. But this house is actually an old archaeologist's house that stands on top of an ancient archaeological site. Your mission is to escape from the house, solving strenuous puzzles and avoiding traps, all while being immersed in its detailed soundscape, which included dynamic background music that heightens tension and changed depending on the situation, and ambient sound effects such as the character's echoing footsteps depending on the surface he walked on. It was also the first fully 3D survival horror game with both player characters and environments in 3D polygons, as opposed to the 3D rendered style of Alone in the Dark. System Shock was released in 1994 and gained a lot of attention in the years following, especially in the world of critics and fame lists. The development team had huge goals for this game, and those goals forced them to abandon Ultima Underworld games and code in Wacom C++ using 32-bit code. That gave them a lot more options in forms of map processing, graphic development, and emitting objects. The scenery of the game is placed in cyberpunk vision of the year 2072. The player is placed in the role of a nameless hacker who is trying to hinder the plans of a malevolent artificial intelligence called Shodan. One of the best features is so-called normal damage, as every attack has its own effect, which is calculated by different criteria such as armor absorption, vulnerabilities, critical hits, and a degree of randomness. System Shock was designed just for floppy disks and was created without any sound. 2 months after its first release, the CD version was released, this time with spoken dialogues, which were spoken mainly by the company employees and their friends. Fans had mixed feelings about the new version, and there are still many players that see each game as a totally unique experience. A lot of horror games at the time were either Lovecraftian or modern times with a horror twist, so this new setting of a futuristic dystopia really opened the field for more drastic settings for future horror games. D has just turned 21 years old, as it was first released on the 1st of April 1995. This game is quite similar to Dr. Hauser, as it also featured a lot of different puzzle elements, but with more horror elements included. D is also the first horror survival game fully based on solving puzzles. Although this was one of the best rated games in 1995, it did not see a huge success in the US due to not enough manufactured copies for PlayStation consoles being made. Well, that did not stop the game selling more than 1 million copies in Japan alone. The story is of the main character, Laura Harris, who is searching for her father in the old hospital/castle while exploring her own family history. One of the interesting features of this game is the inability to pause or save the game. D features 4 different endings, which depend on your actions during your playthrough of the game. Although Alone in the Dark started the isometric top-down survival horror scene, Resident Evil, also known as Biohazard in Japan, really perfected the formula for its time. Resident Evil is one of the most popular zombie franchises around in gaming, although they've strayed away from this in later installments. Originally released in 1996, it paved the way for survival horror games, fusing intense horror for its time with gunplay and puzzle elements. The first Resident Evil was so successful that it spawned 23 other games/remakes. From these games came a huge list of interesting monsters unique to the game series. One of the things that made the original game stand out was the funny dialogues in the English version, which holds the record for worst game dialogue ever in the Guinness World Records Gamer Edition 2008. Although it was funny and contrasted the horror tone the game was going for, it still added to the charm of the game and is something pretty much every player of the game still remembers to this day.
Let me take care of this.
On December 17th, 1992, a Japanese group called ASCII released a program titled RPG T-Cool Dante 98 for the Japanese exclusive home system known as NEC PC 9801, which allowed people to develop their own role-playing games. They further promoted their tool by publishing a monthly magazine titled Logging Softcon, where amateur developers could submit their creations. On April 22nd, 1996, an adventure game called Corpse Party was published in the spring 1996 edition of Login Softcon number 6. It was made by a 22-year-old college student by the name of Makoto Kadoin. The game is composed of 5 chapters, with different main characters that lead to one of numerous possible endings, which are based on decisions you make during the game. Players can also unlock 10 additional chapters, which feature even more unique characters. The main characters include interesting anime-inspired students that have to save the future of your elementary school in Tokyo. Nightmare Creatures was released in 1997 and is a third-person action-adventure game with a horror theme and unique gothic horror elements from the 19th century, featuring numerous grotesque monsters. The player can choose between 2 characters that have different advantages and powers, which has an effect on the game. Lots of weapons are featured in this game. Each character has a selection of primary and secondary weapons such as pistols, mines, firebombs, and magic spells. Players are forced to continuously seek out and win battles to keep their adrenaline bar high enough to be able to continue the game, something which is often the opposite in other horror games. Silent Hill was one of the latest games in the 90s. The main character, Harry Mason, gets caught in mysterious psychological horror when he looks for his missing adopted daughter in the strange town of Silent Hill. The game has multiple endings depending on decisions the player makes during the story, which added a big incentive for replayability, something which really works with a game that surrounds horror. Silent Hill is among the first fully rendered 3D horror games. It is famous for great visuals, and also for the large amount of horror atmosphere in the game. The game is renowned for doing all of this, while combating the technical limitations of the consoles it was released on, such as the fog that eluded the far distance, making you wary of the path ahead, which was actually because of the limitations on graphics. They did a lot well, because the game was not allowed to be released in all countries due to its content, and alterations had to be made in North American and European releases. Kok Tower is a Japanese horror survival game first developed in 1995. It was officially released just in Japan, but the success brought attention, and additional translations of the games and new games of the series were later developed. The first game is known in the US as Kok Tower: The First Fear, and was released in 1997 for PlayStation and Windows. You play as the character Jennifer Simpson, which plays as a point-and-click game with numerous options to control your character. Kok Tower is based mainly on Dario Argento's movie Phenomena and Tony Maylem's film The Burning. This game's main feature is the hiding mechanics, something that really set the standard in horror games to come. At random times, the antagonist, a deformed man called the Scissor Man, would come out of nowhere and approach to attack. You have to find a place to hide in the room you're in, or run away. If not, well, you'll find out why he's called the Scissor Man. The main point of the game is to reveal the secrets of the Barrows Mansion and to escape the Scissor Man. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this week's list, and if you did, leave a like. And if you want to see more lists like this in the future, subscribe. And if you want to see last week's list, click here for the top 10 best looking horror games coming out in 2016. Or click here for the top 10 scariest Resident Evil monsters.